Nobody dared bid for the wild alien girl until a human raised his hand. The air in the subterranean auction house tasted of recycled sweat and the heavy, metallic tang of fear. A massive containment field hummed at the center of the stage, vibrating with the force of the body slamming against it. Inside the shimmering blue walls, Vaylin looked less like a woman and more like a captured storm. Her skin was a deep, iridescent violet that seemed to pulse with every ragged breath she took, and her eyes were wide, glowing pits of amber fire. Gunnar, the auctioneer, wiped a bead of moisture from his brow as he gestured toward her with a shaking hand. He told the crowd that she was the last of the Vakari, a species whose neural signatures were so volatile they could short-circuit a ship's computer. She had already killed 3 handlers, Gunnar shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of the girl's psychic screams. The merchant princes of the Xylos nebula shifted in their seats, their tentacles twitching with unease. They saw a monster, a broken tool that would likely murder its owner before the first jump through hyperspace. No one moved when the opening bid was announced, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight in the room. Vaylin threw herself against the energy bars again, her teeth bared in a snarl that promised bloody retribution. Then, a single hand rose from the back of the murky hall. Caspian sat with his boots propped up on the chair in front of him, his worn leather jacket a stark contrast to the silk robes surrounding him. He did not look at the auctioneer, his gaze remaining fixed on the wild girl in the cage. He offered a sum that made the Xylos princes gasp, a fortune in refined helium-3. He did not flinch when Vaylin turned her amber eyes toward him, her psychic static crashing against his mind like a wave against a cliff. Gunnar hammered the gavel so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted chamber. The crowd parted as Caspian walked toward the stage, his gait steady and devoid of the predatory crouch common among the station's regulars. He climbed the steps, ignoring the frantic warnings of the guards who held their shock staves at the ready. Vaylin crouched in the corner of her cage, her fingers digging into the floor plates as she prepared to spring. Caspian stopped just inches from the containment field, the blue light reflecting in his dark eyes. He reached out, not for a weapon or a remote, but simply held his hand open against the shimmering barrier. The energy hummed against his skin, smelling of ionized gas, but he did not pull away. Vaylin hissed, her violet skin flushing a deeper shade as she felt the alien warmth of his presence. For the first time in her captivity, the psychic noise in her head didn't find a vacuum to explode into. Instead, it hit the dense, rhythmic thrum of a human heart, a biological metronome that refused to break. Caspian looked at the guards, his expression flat and demanding. "Lower the field," Caspian said. Gunnar stammered about safety protocols and liability waivers, his eyes darting to the girl's claws. "She'll rip your throat out before you can blink, human," Gunnar warned. Caspian didn't look back, his focus entirely on the amber-eyed girl who was watching him with a mix of confusion and hatred. "I didn't pay for a bird in a cage," Caspian said. The field dropped with a hiss of decompressing air. Vaylin lunged forward, her movement a blur of violet light, but she stopped with her claws hovering a hair's breadth from his throat. Caspian did not move, his pulse remaining steady even as the girl's hot, frantic breath brushed against his skin. He could feel the power rolling off her, a chaotic energy that would have driven any other species to madness. Slowly, he reached out and wrapped his fingers around her wrist, his thumb pressing against the spot where her blood hammered against her skin. The contact was like a lightning strike, a jolt of raw sensation that made Vaylin gasp, her legs giving way. He caught her before she hit the floor, pulling her against the solid heat of his chest. The audience watched in stunned silence as the wild beast of the Vakari slumped into the human's arms, her forehead resting against his collarbone. She wasn't attacking. She was shivering, her mind finally finding an anchor in the storm of her own making. Caspian swept her up into his arms, her slight frame feeling surprisingly heavy with the density of her alien physiology. He walked past the guards and out of the auction house, his face a mask of iron resolve. They reached his ship, a rugged long-range hauler named the Zora, which sat waiting in the docking bay. Silas, a rival scavenger, watched them from the shadows, his hand resting on the hilt of a disruptor pistol. He couldn't understand why the human wanted the girl, but he knew that anything Caspian valued was worth stealing. Inside the ship, the air was cool and smelled of old grease and filtered oxygen. Caspian carried Vaylin to the medical bay, laying her on the padded table. She gripped his jacket, her nails tearing through the leather as another spasm of psychic energy racked her body. "Stay with me," Vaylin whispered, her voice a melodic rasp that vibrated in his very bones. Caspian sat on the edge of the table, pulling her hands into his own to steady her. He realized then that the Vakari weren't inherently violent. They were hyperempaths whose brains couldn't handle the vast, empty silence of the vacuum between stars. Most aliens had minds that were either too quiet or too alien to provide any feedback, causing the Vakari to spiral into a feedback loop of their own terror. Humans, however, were different. The human brain was a chaotic, noisy mess of emotions, memories, and a biological drive to pack bond with anything that stayed still long enough. Caspian wasn't just a savior, he was a biological grounding wire. He felt her energy beginning to sync with his own, the violet glow of her skin softening into a gentle lavender. She looked up at him, her amber eyes searching his face for any sign of fear or disgust. "Why is it so quiet when you touch me?" Vaylin asked. Her hand drifted up to his chest, feeling the heavy thud of his heart through his shirt. Caspian covered her hand with his, leaning down until their foreheads touched. "We're built to endure, Vaylin," Caspian said. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to soothe the raw edges of her mind. The ship's proximity sensors suddenly blared a warning, a sharp, repetitive chime that cut through the intimacy of the moment. Caspian cursed, recognizing the signature of the ships trailing them. Silas hadn't been content to let his prize walk away so easily. Vaylin sat up, her eyes flashing with a renewed fire, but this time it wasn't the aimless rage of a cornered animal. It was the focused intent of a woman who had finally found something worth protecting. "They want me back," Vaylin said, her fingers curling into fists. Caspian stood, checking the charge on his sidearm with a practiced flick of his wrist. He knew the Zora couldn't outrun the sleek interceptors Silas commanded, not in the crowded debris field of the station's outer rim. He turned to the navigation console, his fingers dancing across the keys as he brought the engines to a low, growling idle. "We aren't running," Caspian said. He looked back at Vaylin, who was watching him with an expression that bordered on awe. No one had ever fought for her before, they had only fought over her. She stood up, her movements fluid and graceful, the iridescent light of her skin casting long shadows across the metal bulkheads. She walked toward him, her hips swaying with a natural, predatory rhythm that made Caspian's breath hitch in his throat. She stopped inches away, her height nearly matching his, and she placed her hands on his shoulders. Her touch no longer felt like a shock, it felt like a beckoning. The revelation hit him then, a truth that the slavers had never guessed. Vaylin wasn't just a psychic anomaly, she was a biological amplifier. When she bonded with a mind as stable as a human's, she could project that stability outward as a weapon. Caspian felt a surge of confidence that wasn't entirely his own, a feeling of absolute power flowing from her into him. "They aren't just coming for a girl," Caspian, Vaylin said. She leaned in, her lips brushing against the shell of his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. "They're coming for the only thing in the galaxy that can make me whole," Vaylin whispered. He turned his head, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of fire and the cold salt of the stars. The kiss was a desperate, hungry thing, a collision of two species that should have been a galaxy apart. Caspian felt her power surging through him, heightening his senses until he could hear the hum of the coolant lines and the distant vibration of the pursuing ships. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking the high ridges of her cheekbones. Her skin was hot, the violet hue intensifying where he touched her, and her breath came in short, jagged gasps. A heavy impact rocked the ship, throwing them against the console as Silas began his opening barrage. Caspian grabbed the flight controls, his muscles tensing as he threw the Zora into a tight roll. The human ship was built for durability, not speed, but Caspian knew every inch of its hull. He dove into the heart of a shattered freighter, the massive ribs of the dead ship providing a graveyard of cover. Silas followed, his interceptors firing bright lances of crimson energy that splashed against the Zora's shields. Caspian didn't fire back with the ship's meager cannons. Instead, he reached out for Vaylin's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Focus on me," Caspian said. He felt her mind open, a vast and beautiful landscape of light that threatened to overwhelm him. He poured his own human stubbornness into her, his refusal to be broken, his absolute certainty that they would survive. Vaylin screamed, but it wasn't a sound of pain. It was a clarion call of power that rippled out from the ship in a visible wave of distortion. The interceptors behind them suddenly veered wildly, their pilots blinded by a psychic backlash that turned their own cockpit displays into static. Caspian seized the moment, spinning the ship around to face their attackers. He didn't use lasers or missiles. He used the gravity well of the nearby station. With a series of maneuvers that would have torn a less durable ship apart, he slung the Zora through a narrow gap in the station's cooling fins. The pursuers, still reeling from Vaylin's mental strike, couldn't react in time. One interceptor clipped a fin and disintegrated in a bloom of orange fire. Another spiraled out of control, its engines screaming as it was sucked into the station's massive intake vents. Silas, in the lead ship, managed to pull up, but he was alone and outmatched by the sheer unpredictability of human tactics. Caspian didn't give him a second chance. He punched the throttle, the Zora's engines roaring as he accelerated directly toward Silas's bridge. At the last second, he flicked the ship into a drift, the reinforced hull of the scavenger ship slamming into the interceptor's wing like a physical hammer. The sound was a deafening screech of metal on metal, a violent, bone-shaking impact that sent Silas spinning into the dark. Caspian didn't wait to see the wreckage. He engaged the jump drive, the stars stretching into long, white lines of light as they vanished into the safety of warp space. The bridge fell silent, the only sound the heavy, synchronized breathing of the two survivors. Vaylin was slumped in her seat, her skin pale and her eyes closed, the effort of the psychic strike having drained her. Caspian unbuckled his harness and knelt beside her, his hand resting on her knee. "We're clear," Caspian said softly. She opened her eyes, the amber fire now a soft, glowing gold. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the line of his jaw, her touch feather-light and full of wonder. "You are so loud, Caspian," Vaylin whispered. She meant his mind, his soul, the sheer presence of him that filled the void she had lived in for so long. She stood up, her body pressing against his as she wound her arms around his neck. The adrenaline from the battle was still humming in their veins, a potent fuel that demanded a different kind of release. Caspian lifted her, his hands gripping the firm curves of her thighs as he carried her toward the back of the ship. He kicked the door to his quarters open, the small room bathed in the soft, red glow of the emergency lights. He set her down on the bed, his eyes dark with a hunger that he no longer tried to hide. Vaylin reached for the buttons of his shirt, her movements urgent and clumsy in her haste. She stripped away the fabric, her eyes widening as she saw the scars on his chest, the history of a man who had fought for everything he had. She leaned forward, her lips pressing against the center of his chest, right over his heart. The vibration of his heartbeat seemed to pulse through her entire body, a rhythmic anchor that allowed her to let go of her control. Caspian groaned, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her up for another kiss. This time, it wasn't a clash, it was a fusion. He could feel her thoughts, her desires, her need to be claimed by someone who wasn't afraid of the storm inside her. He pushed her back onto the pillows, his body a heavy, welcome weight above her. The intimacy was more than just physical, it was a bridge between two worlds. Caspian moved with a deliberate, slow intensity, his hands exploring every inch of her iridescent skin. He found the places where she was most sensitive, the spots where the violet light flared brightest under his touch. Vaylin arched her back, her breath hitching as he trailed his mouth down the column of her throat. She felt a sense of peace that was almost impossible to describe, a stillness that only came when she was wrapped in his arms. Every time his skin met hers, a soft hum of energy rippled between them, a biological harmony that the galaxy had never seen. She realized that humans were the missing piece of the Vakari puzzle, the only species with a nervous system robust enough to survive the connection. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer, wanting to vanish into the heat of him. Caspian buried his face in the crook of her neck, his voice a low, guttural sound of praise. He told her how beautiful she was, not like a star or a moon, but like a living, breathing force of nature. The suggestive tension in the room was a thick, palpable thing, a field of energy that made the very air vibrate. They moved together in a dance as old as time, a primal rhythm that transcended language and culture. In that small, dark room, the scavenger and the wild girl became something more than the sum of their parts. They were a new paradigm, a testament to the fact that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their weapons. It was their capacity to love the things that the rest of the universe was too terrified to touch. As the ship hurtled through the void, they found a home in each other. The aftermath of their union left them tangled together in the quiet of the cooling engines. Vaylin lay with her head on Caspian's chest, her skin glowing with a satisfied, steady light. She felt the silent resonance of the galaxy around them, but it no longer hurt. It was just background noise, a distant hum that was easily ignored in favor of the man holding her. Caspian stroked her hair, his mind already turning to the future. They couldn't go back to the station, and Silas would eventually find a way to track them if they stayed in known space. But he wasn't worried. He had a ship, he had his wits, and he had the most powerful weapon in the galaxy by his side. He knew that news of their escape would spread, and that other Vakari might hear of the human who could quiet the storm. Maybe that was the role humans were meant to play in the grander scheme of things, the anchors for the lost, the steady hand in the dark. Vaylin looked up at him, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "What are you thinking, human?" Vaylin asked. Caspian laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the cabin. "I'm thinking that I've got a lot of work to do if I'm going to keep you fed and happy," Caspian said. He leaned down, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that spoke of a lifetime of commitment. They were outcasts, survivors in a universe that had tried to break them both. But as the Zora dropped out of warp and faced a new, uncharted sector of space, they didn't feel like victims. They felt like conquerors. Caspian took the controls, his hand steady and his heart full. Beside him, Vaylin watched the stars, her amber eyes reflecting the infinite possibilities of their new life.